Well, gang, these days we really expect to do nearly everything through a web browser. Am I right? I mean, that's how I check my email. It's how I expect to interface with most of my management tools these days. I mean, the web is simply the way that we access everything. I mean, what we're looking right now, the graphical interface for a wireless controller. How do we get to it? Through HTTP, right? It's all web-based these days. So authenticating our wireless devices through a form, through a web form, is a very normal part of how we do business. So recognize that our wireless controllers, wireless control modules, or wireless LAN controllers, as they work in conjunction with their access points that are associated with our clients, have the ability to present me a web-based interface in order to log on. That's called web authentication. What that means is that our controllers are actually starting off with a certificate pre-installed. Now, you may get some certificate errors, of course, when you actually open that up on your client. So you can take that certificate and you can enable it that it is approved, that it is a trusted certificate locally. If you're in, say, an Active Directory environment, you might take that certificate, export it, import it into group policy, and get everyone to trust it automatically. Or if you manage your own certificates, there are tools to be able to import in the certificates in order to support web authentication. So we've gone to configuration to manage security, and actually what we're looking at is down here. I apologize, it's off the list. It's below where we can see, but we have a section for web authentication, and specifically we're looking at the web authentication parameter map. What's right below that is actually certificates, where I would go to install certificates if necessary. The idea is if I want to enable web authentication, here's where we set the global configurations. And here under type, there's two key types of web authentication that we're going to use most of the time. There is consent, in which I simply say, yes, I'm logging on to your corporate network. I agree not to, do anything heinous. So it's basically just agreeing to a use license. And then you have a web authentication. This is going to be what actually prompts you for a name and password. Now, a couple other ones. There's authentication bypass, in which we can actually authenticate except when we see a particular browser, in which case we can skip it. It's a particular configuration used for certain applications. And then you have web consent, in which you will actually have the clients both authenticate and agree to consent. The reason why you normally would skip that for a web authentication is because you've probably already got the users defined and they've already signed off on something in order to work with your corporate network. So it just depends on the type of network that you're describing in this environment. So this environment right now, we're looking at the wireless controller, and right now we want to focus again, as we said, on consent, just basically kind of a pass-through, and web authentication, where we're actually logging in. Again, we can add additional IP addresses, virtual IP addresses for this web hosting, IPv4 or v6, and different host names. This is for the browser-based interface that we're going to be working with. What are the browsers going to be pointing to? Now in our, here we go, web authentication, we can see the web authentication parameter map is where we're located. And now we've moved on to the advanced section here looking at customized pages. So there are 4 default pages to describe essentially the 4 default web behaviors that we're expecting to have happen. So you have the login page, authentication proxy login. This is what will, for example, pass you, where we have a presentation. Hey, put in a name and password. We have a successful authentication proxy page, essentially a place to say, here's where, congratulations, you logged in, you're good to go. Might even have a link embedded in it. Failed authentication, sorry, your name and password failed. You might want to try that again. And then expired, you've tried a name and password too many times, 3 strikes, you're out, something like that, and you've been redirected. So there are 4 default pages. You can actually go in and customize these pages directly or create your own HTML files and direct to those. Those could be stored locally in Flash. We also could point to a remote location. Notice we have the ability to redirect to an external server. So if that's where you're already doing all of your web-based environments, your web-based content, sure, I could point over there and let that kind of just follow through. Then again, somewhere we need to actually have user accounts, right? So how are we getting to the user accounts that are going to be put into play behind the name and password that I'm entering in there? And for example, we could create network access users here in ICE, right, as our radius authentication device. And that certainly is one way to manage it. We could also move forward over to, if I have something centralized like Active Directory, then the ICE could look to Active Directory. And that certainly works fine. Additionally, we can actually specify, again, the radius servers and even the LDAP servers if we want to support an LDAP environment, Active Directory, or another directory service. And those will be used by web authentication, all right? Once I have built the method list. Once again, we come back to method list used for authentication and authorization. So here we have the authentication. Again, it's going to be a login group, right, for authentication, proving the name and password. And this is where I point to my radius servers. So again, similar process, may or may not actually be the same servers that I might use for standard radius authentication based upon .1x. But notice in this case, it's not .1x, it's login. All right, so a little different method needed in order to make this happen. Under the authorization component, once again, we need a method list, and this is going to be a network group as opposed to, for example, like a local credential download that we would use if we were defining local names and passwords. This is pointing again to that radius server and to its accounts, and here we have, again, the pointer to that radius server group that, for example, in our example, has ICE there. And then we get to actually using it. Remember, it's great to build a method list, great to have all these names and accounts, great to say this is how we do web authentication, great to have those customized pages, but it doesn't do you a lick of good unless your wireless LAN actually calls upon it. So, key thing to notice here, we're in our wireless LAN, we've selected 802.1x, and in this case, we've said that we want to use web authentication, and here for security, we've chosen layer 3. Now, if I was normally pointing for .1x, .1x is a layer 2 technology and therefore is directly applied right there as layer 2 forwarding to radius, right? Here we have layer 3. So I have an enabled web policy support. And here's my redirection list, web radius for authentication. And then we have our authentication parameter map. That's actually the pages, right? The specific pages that we're pointing to, if they're local or redirected, custom or default, all of that. And then we have just a couple of, option for access control lists, jump to this if you fail on MAC address support, have conditional based web redirect if you need to. So we've got several other options. Notice on the AAA side of things, once we jump to that, that's left disabled because the radius configuration is embedded here. We do not need to specify the radius server additionally here. That's not the way it works. So again, layer 2 and radius server, AAA server, when we're doing our .1x configuration, everything's here in the layer 3 configuration when we're using web authentication.